To comprehend the convulsion that was America's entry into the Second World War, one must first understand the profound bone-deep slumber of the nation during the 90s. The America of that decade was a country turned inward, consumed by its own private catastrophe, the Great Depression. The roaring optimism of the 1920s had vanished, replaced by the grim reality of breadlines, Dust Bowl migrations, and millions of unemployed. The nation's gaze was fixed on its own ailing heartland, not on the dark clouds gathering over distant continents. This inward focus bred a fierce and powerful isolationism, a political philosophy born from a bitter memory. The sacrifice of World War I, the war to end all wars, felt like a betrayal. Over 116,000 American lives had been spent. And for what? For a Europe that quickly fell back into its old habits of cynical power politics, leaving America to deal with the economic and social fallout. The prevailing sentiment, amplified by figures like Senator Gerald Nye and his highly publicized Merchants of Death hearings, was that America had been duped into the last war by international bankers and munitions manufacturers. Never again, the thinking went, would American boys die to protect foreign interests or settle ancient European squabbles. This sentiment was not a fringe opinion, it was the dominant political and cultural force of the era. While America wrestled with its own demons, the world outside was methodically being set ablaze. In Germany, a charismatic and hate-fueled demagogue, Adolf Hitler, rose from obscurity to seize absolute power, transforming Germany into the totalitarian Third Reich. His vision, laid bare in his book Mein Kampf, was one of racial purity, territorial expansion, Lebensraum, and the violent destruction of his enemies, both internal and external. In Italy, Benito Mussolini and his black shirts had already established a fascist state, dreaming of a new Roman Empire. And in the East, the Empire of Japan, driven by a militaristic government and a belief in its own divine destiny, had invaded Manchuria in 1931 and launched a full-scale, brutal invasion of China in 19... These were not isolated events. They were the synchronized movements of aggressive, expansionist powers who saw the world as a zero-sum game of conquest. They despised democracy, glorified violence, and were openly rearming in defiance of international treaties. The League of Nations, the international body created to prevent such a catastrophe, proved to be a toothless tiger, utterly incapable of stopping them. In the White House, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt watched these developments with a growing sense of dread. A former Assistant Secretary of the Navy and a committed internationalist, he saw the existential threat posed by the Axis powers far more clearly than most of his countrymen. In a 1937 speech in Chicago, he tried to awaken the nation, proposing a quarantine of aggressor nations to protect the world from the epidemic of world lawlessness. The public reaction was overwhelmingly hostile. He was branded a warmonger, accused of trying to drag the country into another foreign entanglement. The powerful isolationist bloc in Congress responded by passing a series of neutrality acts, laws designed to legislate America out of any future war. These acts forbade the sale of arms, the extension of loans, and even travel by American citizens on the ships of belligerent nations. They were, in effect, a declaration of determined irrelevance, an attempt to build a legislative fortress around the United States. FDR was a political master, but he was trapped between his understanding of the global danger and the unshakable will of the American people to ignore it. As Hitler annexed Austria, dismembered Czechoslovakia at Munich, and signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin that greenlit the invasion of Poland, America stood by, a silent, distant giant, convinced that the fire consuming the old world could never reach its shores. The illusion of a fortress America, safe behind its two oceans, was shattered on September 1, 1939. On that day, Adolf Hitler's Wehrmacht stormed across the Polish border, unleashing a terrifying new form of warfare, the Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. The synchronized onslaught of tanks, dive bombers, and infantry crushed the Polish army in a matter of weeks. In response, Great Britain and France, finally abandoning their failed policy of appeasement, declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun. For most Americans, it was still a phony war, a distant European conflict. But in the spring of 1940, the storm broke in all its fury. Hitler unleashed his blitzkrieg on Western Europe, conquering Denmark and Norway, then smashing through the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. The unthinkable happened next. The German army outflanked the supposedly impenetrable Maginot Line and sent the French and British armies reeling. The fall of France in June 1940, in just 6 weeks, was a seismic shock. The world watched in horror as Nazi stormtroopers goose-stepped down the Champs-Élysées in Paris. Suddenly, Great Britain stood alone, a final bastion of democracy in Europe, bracing for a German invasion. The fall of France was the wake-up call Franklin Roosevelt had been waiting for. The danger was no longer theoretical, it was immediate and existential. If Britain fell, Hitler would control the shipyards of Europe and the formidable British fleet, posing a direct threat to the Western Hemisphere. With the isolationist argument now severely weakened, FDR began a masterful campaign to turn the United States into what he would famously call the Great Arsenal of Democracy. He took bold, politically risky steps to aid Britain. In September 1940, he bypassed Congress with an executive agreement, the Destroyers for Bases deal, trading 50 aging American destroyers to the Royal Navy in exchange for 99-year leases on British naval and air bases in the Atlantic. That same month, he pushed through the Selective Training and Service Act, the first peacetime military draft in American history. These were controversial moves, fiercely opposed by the America First Committee, an influential isolationist group with celebrity spokesmen like aviator Charles Lindbergh, who argued that aiding Britain would inevitably lead to war. FDR's re-election for an unprecedented third term in November 1940 gave him the political mandate he needed for his most audacious plan yet. With Britain running out of money to buy American arms, Roosevelt proposed a new system, Lend-Lease. In a fireside chat, he explained the concept with a simple, brilliant analogy. "Suppose my neighbour's home catches fire," he said, "and I have a length of garden hose. I don't say to him before that operation, 'Neighbour, my garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me $15 for it. I want my garden hose back after the fire is over.'" The Lend-Lease Act, passed in March 1941, effectively ended any pretense of American neutrality. It gave the president the authority to sell, transfer, exchange, or lend equipment and supplies to any nation deemed vital to the defense of the United States. The spigot was opened. American factories, still shaking off the rust of the Depression, began a staggering transformation. Assembly lines that once produced cars began churning out tanks, bombers, and jeeps. The dormant industrial might of the United States began to stir, slowly at first, then with gathering, unstoppable momentum. The nation was still officially at peace, but it was now fully engaged in an economic war against the Axis. American ships began escorting British convoys, leading to an undeclared naval war with German U-boats in the Atlantic. The giant was no longer sleeping, it was awake, angry, and forging the weapons that would ultimately decide the fate of the world. The only question left was not if America would enter the war, but how and when. This section will be a tense, minute-by-minute recreation of December 7, 1941. It will begin from the Japanese perspective, detailing Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's audacious plan and the long journey of the Kido Butai carrier strike force across the Pacific. We will explore the intelligence failures and missed signals on the American side, the ignored submarine sighting, the dismissed radar contact. The narrative will then shift to the terrifying, chaotic reality of the attack itself, told through the eyes of sailors, pilots, and nurses at PearlHarbor. We will detail the destruction of Battleship Row, the heroic but futile attempts to fight back, and the sinking of the USS Arizona, which became the symbol of the tragedy. The second half of the section will cover the immediate aftermath, the shock and rage that swept across America, the end of isolationism in a single morning, and FDR's iconic Day of Infamy speech to Congress, leading to a near-unanimous declaration of war. This chapter explores the colossal transformation of American society. The focus is on the production miracle, as American industry outproduced all other nations combined. We will tell the story of Rosie the Riveter and the millions of women who entered the workforce, forever changing social norms. The narrative will cover the daily realities of wartime life: rationing of gas, sugar, and meat, scrap metal drives, and the immense popularity of war bonds. This section will also confront the dark side of this mobilization, it will detail the racial tensions and riots, and the shameful internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, a decision driven by fear and prejudice. The story of the Tuskegee Airmen and other segregated units will be used to highlight the paradox of fighting for freedom abroad while denying it to citizens at home. This section covers the desperate dark days of early 1942, when the Japanese Empire seemed unstoppable. We will chronicle the fall of the Philippines, the heroic but doomed defense of Bataan and Corregidor, and the subsequent horror of the Bataan Death March. The narrative will highlight the immense psychological need for a victory, which led to the daring Doolittle raid, a one-way bombing mission over Tokyo that did little physical damage, but provided a massive morale boost. The turning point of the Pacific War will be the centerpiece, the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first naval battle fought entirely by aircraft, which halted the Japanese advance on Australia. This will be followed by the decisive Battle of Midway, where brilliant US intelligence and courageous dive bomber pilots led to the sinking of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, a catastrophic blow from which the Japanese Navy would never recover. This chapter shifts to the Europe First strategy and the first major American ground combat of the war. We will explore the strategic decision to invade North Africa, Operation Torch as a way to engage the Germans, relieve pressure on the Soviets, and gain combat experience. The narrative will introduce key American commanders like Dwight D. Eisenhower and the flamboyant, controversial George S. Patton. We will detail the initial landings and the disastrous first encounter with the Germans at Kasserine Pass, a humbling defeat that forced the US Army to rapidly learn and adapt. The section will follow the grueling desert campaign, culminating in the defeat of Rommel's famed Afrika Korps and the Allied victory in North Africa in May. This section focuses on what was supposed to be the soft underbelly of Europe. It will begin with the successful invasion of Sicily and the downfall of Mussolini. The main narrative, however, will be the brutal, grinding, and often forgotten campaign up the mountainous spine of mainland Italy. We will detail the difficult amphibious landing at Salerno, the bloody stalemate at the Gustav Line, and the desperate, costly battles for Monte Cassino. The story of the controversial and risky Anzio landing will be told, showing how a planned daring breakout turned into another miserable siege. This chapter will emphasize the harsh conditions and heavy casualties, highlighting the tenacity of the German defenders and the immense price paid for the eventual liberation of Rome. This chapter delves into the unique brutality of the Pacific theater. We will explain the island-hopping strategy developed to bypass heavily fortified Japanese islands and seize key locations as forward bases for the advance on Japan. The narrative will begin with the pivotal Guadalcanal campaign, a 6-month jungle nightmare of land, sea, and air battles that marked the first major American offensive. The focus will then shift to the Central Pacific Drive, highlighting the horrific amphibious assault on Tarawa, where thousands of Marines died in a few hours, providing bloody lessons for future invasion. This section will stress the fanatical nature of Japanese resistance, where surrender was not an option, setting the stage for the even bloodier battles to come. This section is dedicated to the massive strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany. We will follow the crews of the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator on their perilous daylight missions deep into enemy territory. The narrative will emphasize the incredible bravery and the staggering casualty rates. At one point, an airman had a better chance of surviving the war as a POW than completing his tour of. We'll detail the technological race between Allied bombers and German fighters and anti-aircraft defenses. The turning point of the air war will be the introduction of the P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter that could escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back breaking the back of the German Luftwaffe and ensuring Allied air supremacy for D-Day. This chapter is a deep dive into June 6, 1944, the single most famous day of the war. It will start with the immense logistical build-up in Britain and the elaborate deception plan, Operation Fortitude, that fooled the Germans. The narrative will follow General Eisenhower's agonizing decision to launch the invasion despite poor weather. We will tell the story from multiple perspectives. The paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne dropping behind enemy lines in the dark, the British and Canadians at Gold, Juno and Sword Beaches, the Americans at Utah Beach. The climax will be the horrific, near-disastrous assault on Omaha Beach, detailing the courage and initiative of the soldiers who, pinned down and leaderless, managed to fight their way off the beach and crack Hitler's Atlantic Wall. This section covers the brutal fighting that followed the D-Day landings. The narrative will focus on the battle for Normandy, specifically the nightmarish fighting in the Bocage, the dense hedgerow country that was perfect for defence, then turned the campaign into a bloody slog. We will detail Operation Cobra, General Patton's armoured breakout that finally shattered the German lines. This will be followed by the story of the Falaise Pocket, where the German 7th Army was encircled and annihilated. The section culminates in the exhilarating race across France and the triumphant, joyous liberation of Paris in August 1944, a moment of immense symbolic importance. This chapter focuses on the largest and bloodiest battle the US ever fought. It begins with the surprise German Ardennes offensive in the dead of winter, December 1944. Hitler's goal was to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp, forcing a negotiated peace. We will detail the initial shock and retreat of the unprepared American forces. The centerpiece of the narrative will be the heroic defense of the vital crossroads town of Bastogne by the 101st Airborne, surrounded and undersupplied. We will highlight General Anthony McAuliffe's famous one-word reply to a German surrender demand. Nuts. The story will cover the brutal fighting in freezing conditions and the eventual arrival of Patton's Third Army to relieve the siege, breaking the back of Hitler's final offensive. This section chronicles the final months of the war in Europe. The narrative will follow the Allied armies as they push towards and across the Rhine River, the last major geographic barrier to Germany's heartland, focusing on the dramatic capture of the bridge at Remagen. As American forces plunged deeper into Germany, they made a horrifying discovery: the Nazi concentration and death camps. This part of the narrative will detail the liberation of camps like Buchenwald and Dachau, and the profound, sickening shock experienced by the soldiers who witnessed the depths of Nazi depravity. The section will also cover the race to Berlin, won by the Soviets, the death of Franklin Roosevelt, Hitler's suicide in his bunker, and the final, unconditional surrender of Germany, leading to the massive VE, Victory in Europe, Day celebration. This chapter returns to the Pacific for the horrific endgame. The closer the Allies get to Japan, the more fanatical and suicidal the resistance becomes. The first part will focus on the Battle of Iwo Jima, a month-long fight for a tiny volcanic island needed as an emergency bomber base. We will detail the brutal fighting and the iconic flag raising on Mount Suribachi. The second part will cover the Battle of Okinawa, the last major battle of the war. We will describe the massive scale of the fighting, the introduction of the kamikaze as a systematic weapon, the staggering casualties on both sides, and the immense death toll among the Okinawan civilian population. This battle is presented as a terrifying preview of what an invasion of the Japanese home islands would look like, heavily influencing the decision to come. The final section explores the war's secret history and its world-altering conclusion. It begins with the Manhattan Project, the top-secret, multi-billion-dollar program to build an atomic bomb, driven by the fear that the Nazis would get one first. We will introduce figures like J. Robert Oppenheimer and General Leslie Groves, and describe the successful Trinity test in the New Mexico desert. The narrative will then focus on President Harry Truman, who inherited the project after FDR's death and had to make the agonizing decision to use the weapon. We will chronicle the bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki 3 days later. The section will conclude with Japan's surrender, the VJ Day celebrations, and a somber reflection on the new reality. The world had survived its greatest war, only to enter the atomic age, standing at the dawn of a new Cold War confrontation between the two victorious superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union.